Good afternoon. I'm Karen Narasaki, and I'll be your moderator today. Welcome to this briefing on COVID-19 threats to democracy and to public safety through the lens of the Asian American experience. Sponsored by the American Bar Association section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, this panel is one of a series of rapid response webinars. We thank the section for making many of these webinars open to the general public and available at no cost. The ABA CRSJ section has been organizing COVID-19 programming on a variety of issues. So we invite you to visit americanbar.org/CRSJ for more information. During today's program, we encourage the audience to ask questions. As an attendee, you should be able to see a control panel with controls such as audio options, chat, raise hand, and Q&A. For the purposes of this webinar, we ask that you submit your questions through the Q&A, not the chat function. We'll be using the chat function to send you links to relevant materials mentioned by the speakers. If you do not see these controls, please check your screen is not idle and move your cursor to hover over the bottom of the screen where they should appear. We'll address questions at the end of the panel discussion, but you could type them in at any time. We will be sharing a recording of this program to everyone who is registered so that you can share it with your networks. Please feel free to leave the ABA with feedback or ask questions for follow-up. And before we go into our program though, I'd like to introduce Judy Perry-Martinez, President of the American Bar Association, for a few remarks. Judy?
Well, thank you, Karen, so very much for moderating this panel, and welcome to all the attendees who have gathered today for this very important topic. Let me thank the section of Civil Rights and Social Justice of the American Bar Association and the numerous co-sponsors for this webinar, which is part of that series that Karen just spoke about, looking at the pandemic and the impact on civil rights and social justice issues. We also appreciate our esteemed panel that's gathered today. All of them, and among them are two ABA Spirit of Excellence awardees, Karen Narasaki, our moderator, and Don Tamaki. Thank you both and all of you for being here with us. As we are troubled by the disparities of the COVID-19 impacts on communities of color at the ABA, we are also very concerned about the reports of hate incidents and crimes targeting Asian Americans in their community at a time when unity as a nation is critical. 2 weeks ago, the American Bar Association stood with the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association and other affinity bar leaders in a video which was meant to be a stand against the targeting of Asian Americans and to speak out against racism and hate that we're seeing. Treating others differently, bullying, avoiding people in their businesses because they are Asian or Pacific Islanders is plainly unacceptable. And this disease does not discriminate, as we all know. Discrimination distracts from the problems before us and only perpetuates unfounded stereotypes. We cannot allow racism to rise as we come together as a nation to take on this challenge. As leaders of bar associations across the nation, as individuals who care so much about our communities in which we live and work, we are speaking out against hate and bias. We are calling for everyone to focus on unity and denounce anti-Asian attacks, xenophobia, and racist language. And again, we thank you who have all gathered across the nation to listen to this important webinar and ask that you continue to do your part to combat racism and to promote unity. As the voice of America's legal profession, the ABA is proud to offer a wealth of educational programs and other resources on a wide range of implications of the pandemic. And we invite you to utilize them, to learn from them, and to share your insights with your communities as you reach out to help those in need. With that, I now turn it over to our esteemed panel and our program moderator, Karen Narasaki, a former commissioner of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And again, we're honored to have all of you gathered for this panel and to share with us your wonderful experience, your knowledge, and all you have to offer. Thank you.
Thank you, President Perry Martinez. On behalf of the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, I want to thank you and acknowledge the ABA for joining on to that statement denouncing the rising number of incidents involving anti-Asian discrimination and the racist remarks related to the coronavirus and COVID-19, and joining and calling on the legal community to stand united against discrimination. It means a lot to our community to know that the ABA is standing with us. For today's program on COVID-19 threats to democracy and to public safety through the lens of the Asian American experience, we are very fortunate to have an extremely illustrious group of experts to share their analysis of this issue. Our panelists today are Matt Stevens, who is a national political reporter for the New York Times. He's been covering the primary elections, and he recently covered the campaign of entrepreneur Andrew Yang, and has also been covering the escalation in anti-Asian bias and hate crimes. He's a former board member of the Asian American Journalists Association. Don Tamaki is the managing partner of Minami Tamaki LLP. Don served on the legal team that reopened the 1944 US Supreme Court case of Fred Korematsu, overturning his criminal conviction for defying the removal of almost 120,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps. He was a 2020 recipient of the ABA Spirit of Excellence Award. And then also Helen Zia, civil rights activist and author. Her books include Last Boat Out of Shanghai, Asian American Dreams, and My Country versus Me. She's a board chair emerita of the Women's Media Center and a founder in the Justice for Vincent Chin campaign, one of the seminal points in the modern day Asian American movement. Helen is outspoken on issues ranging from human rights and peace to women's rights and countering hate violence and homophobia. Before we go to the panelists, I've been asked to set the stage. As many of you know, there's been a recent spike in verbal and physical assaults on Asian Americans in recent weeks, which Matt Stevens and others have reported on. As you'll hear from our panelists, there's reason to believe that at least some of it is sparked by the president's insistence early on in calling the coronavirus the Chinese flu. One White House official referred to it as the Kung Flu flu to CBS reporter Wei Jia-chang. Sadly, this is not a new behavior. One of the last reports the US Commission on Civil Rights issued before my term as a commissioner ended last November addressed the dramatic rise in hate crimes since the president's election. In a statement expressing grave concerns about the rise in anti-Asian racism, the Commission noted that the attacks undermine the fundamental equality principles in our Constitution and our laws. The defenders of the use of these terms have dismissed the critics as liberal snowflakes and insisted that it is a race-neutral description of where the virus was first found, or that the name refers to the Chinese government rather than the Chinese people. However, the World Health Organization has warned against characterizing this pandemic as the Chinese flu because of the very predictable discriminatory consequences. Researchers found a significant rise in racial slurs when the president used the term on social media. In addition to serious physical violence and hate directed towards children, as well as adults, the racism and xenophobia has had economic repercussions. Prior to the business shutdowns, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley from Massachusetts noted that restaurants in Boston's Chinatown had seen up to an 80% drop in their business. After much criticism and concerns expressed by Asian Americans and many others, the president didn't apologize, but did say in a tweet, "It is very important that we totally protect our Asian American community in the United States and all around the world," noting that the spreading of the virus is not their fault in any way, shape, or form. However, during this election season, the Asian American community has reason to believe the problem is not going to fade away. So this topic remains a very timely one. In addition to discussing the problem in the context of anti-Asian violence, panelists will be offering recommendations on how all of us can be responding, particularly the legal profession, as well as discussing the threats to our democracy. I will be asking the panelists 3 rounds of questions, and then we will turn to Q&A. So please remember to write in your questions in the Q&A function so that we can see them. In the chat box, as I said before, we will be providing links to materials that are mentioned during the program. As we turn to the panel, we will run this brief video of one incident that went viral.
Hand sanitizer, come here. Sanitize your ass. Come here. Here. Here, you need some. Come here.
So we're going to start first with Matt. Matt, what are we seeing in terms of anti-Asian violence and how is it being covered by the media?
Thank you so much for setting that up, Karen. That was just a fantastic overview of what we've been seeing, unfortunately, over the last several months. And I'll start there. I think our reporting at the New York Times about the coronavirus began probably in early January or so. One of the first articles that I was looking at the other day was dated January 8th. And the headline of that story that I'm looking at right now is China identifies new virus causing pneumonia-like illness in what is at the time maybe one of the most understated headlines for a virus that we did not know much about at that time. I've reported subsequently talking with Asian American leaders and certainly, congressional folks, people in politics, because that's my space. And people told me even in March that as they were reflecting back, they thought about in January when this virus first became an issue that, oh gosh, we sort of know how these things go. And they began to have concerns that we would see xenophobic and racist incidents toward Asian Americans. And indeed, as we saw in that video, and as we'll see in, I think, a subsequent video we're going to play here in a second, we did see those incidents, just a couple of them that started to bubble up into the national media, involved a young 16-year-old kid in the San Fernando Valley in California who was attacked by bullies who accused him of having the virus. I think we will see in the video a New York City woman wearing a mask who was assaulted, kicked, and punched in a Manhattan subway station. And of course, the list goes on and on. To the extent that we then saw a study from San Francisco State University report that there was a 50% rise in the number of news stories related to coronavirus and anti-Asian American discrimination in the months of February and early March. And so we did start to see some pushback from leaders in the community. Judy Chu, who is the Congresswoman from California and the chairwoman of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, sent a letter to her colleagues urging them to tamp down on these misconceptions. And yet, by mid-March, that's when what Karen was referring to, the sort of China or Chinese virus rhetoric began coming from President Trump, which, as she noted, he did defend. That rhetoric was echoed by various Republicans and other backers of the Trump administration. And that, for better or worse, then ignited a lot of pushback from historians, public health experts, and folks in the Asian American communities who noted the problems that creates in terms of creating xenophobia and just sort of the inaccuracy of those types of framework. So Mr. Trump did relent and send a tweet saying it was very important that we totally protect our Asian American community. Of course, to many folks in the community, that came too late. By mid-March, when I was doing my story there that you can see on the left, several groups had developed toolkits for reporting of incidents, and we were in the hundreds of reported incidents at that time. Surely hundreds more episodes, racist episodes had happened, but folks just had not reported them. And one of the things I was really struck by was talking to Asian American leaders like Representative Ming, who you see there, and Mr. Yang, the presidential candidate, who said that even they as some of the highest profile members of the community felt really subconscious that you can't change your Asian American skin, and being on the street was a strange experience at this time. So that continued, and to the extent that we thought this issue might have subsided, well, as recently as last week, we saw a new Trump campaign ad come forward that I think pretty clearly signaled that the campaign wishes to exploit xenophobia and racial animus, racial divide in the re-election campaign. It was an attack ad on Joseph R. Biden Jr., the vice president, the former vice president, the Democratic nominee, essentially calling him soft on China. And it did include an image of former governor of Washington, Gary Locke, who is Asian American, of course, but out of context, it might have looked to some like he was a Chinese official. So this reignited this controversy all over again. And here we are in April. And I think some of what I've been hearing from folks in the community is just that the concern is this sort of rhetoric and this sort of hate could continue for the foreseeable future. Karen, you might be on mute.
I just did what I told my panelists not to do, forget to take myself off mute. So we're going to Helen, and we are going to ask her to add her observations as well as to put this all into a little bit of historical and current day context. Helen?
Yeah, thanks, Karen, and thank you, Matt, for such a comprehensive overview, and to the Bar Association for putting this very important discussion available. You know, one of the disturbing things that have come out of the months now of incidents that Matt just talked about is a reaction that, oh, so Asian Americans are discovering racism now for the first time. And, you know, a sort of welcome to the club of racism in America. But in fact, the kind of anti-Asian racism and discrimination and prejudice that we're seeing today has a long and ugly history. Certainly members of the bar know from their law school lives, and anyone who studies American history knows that in the 1800s, there were really what I call ethnic cleansing, a series of laws, Supreme Court cases that were brought on that were aimed at ridding America of all people of Asian descent. And those involved lynchings, massacres, burnings, destructions of communities, a time when, for example, the Western United States had many, many people of Chinese descent, in particular the state of Idaho. The majority population at one time was Chinese. Can anybody imagine that today? And the reason it's not, you know, now it's considered one of the whitest states in the Union. And why is that? Because there was concerted ethnic cleansing. And so the idea that Asian Americans are discovering this for the first time is simply not true. The fact is that maybe America and outside of the Asian American community are beginning to get a little bit of an insight is really what's happening. And more recently, I mean, we may know, people may know a little bit that there was an internment of 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent during World War II. But in more current time, I think the more similar example to what we're going through today took place in the 1980s with the collapse of the American auto industry and the breakdown of the manufacturing sector, when in Detroit, there was a oil crisis, you know, in the late 1970s. Nobody bought American cars anymore because they only got 7 or 8 or 9 miles a gallon, and the industry collapsed. I lived in Detroit then. I had worked in an auto factory, and I was one of the millions of people who were suddenly out of work, unemployed, out of a job in a very high-paying factory job that allowed people to have pretty good lives. And what happened instead were people were suddenly unemployed for the foreseeable future. They lost everything, their homes, second homes, 2 or 3 cars, recreational vehicles, but more important, they lost their future. They lost a sense that their children could get a good job in the industry that they had been part of. And in times of great misery, which we know we are in now and really only in the beginnings, people were suffering, they were angry, they were frustrated, and what we saw then we are seeing today, which is that governments, companies, people start looking for somebody to blame. And it didn't take long for the corporate officials, for even union leaders, government officials to start blaming Japan. They all agreed that Japan was the enemy because Japan made fuel efficient cars. And the same terminology we're hearing today. We are at war. We are at war with a virus, but we are at war, many are saying, and as Matt described the election propaganda that's coming out right now, we're at war with China. That's where the war began. And what happens when you start talking about war is you're talking about an enemy of people. And so during that time in the 1980s that carried over into the 1990s, Japan was the enemy and anyone who looked Japanese. And what do you do with an enemy? You kill them. People in the, Congress people in Washington and corporate C-suites were saying, let's send over atomic bombs to Japan again because we are at a war. And that kind of hate speech and innuendo led directly to frustrated people attacking anyone who looked Japanese. And in those days, a landmark hate crime civil rights case came out about a Chinese American man who was killed, Vincent Chin, for looking Japanese. Now, even though that was the landmark name case that came out of it, there were many, many, many other hate crimes that happened, including mass killings, the shooting of an elementary school that was predominantly Southeast Asian and Cambodian children. A number of children and teachers were shot to death in that incident. And one of the frightening patterns that also came out of that is that law enforcement in that mass killing and several other hate crimes, and including the case of Vincent Chin's killing, are immediately dismissed that, oh, this isn't possibly involving racism, without any investigation, and certainly partly due to the ignorance and invisibility that Asian Americans have and the prejudice that has long existed toward Asian Americans. And sadly, we're seeing a very similar pattern today, with this whole idea of, oh, you Asians, so you get spat on, coughed on, beaten up, so your children are getting stabbed. So there's a murder that is now being investigated as a possible hate crime. So the FBI is saying that far right extremist groups, neo-Nazi groups, white supremacist groups are now chatting a lot about attacking Asian Americans. So you're discovering this for the first time. Well, that's part of the pattern that we've seen over the years. And it's a sad day when the Surgeon General himself says, we are at war. This is our Pearl Harbor moment. This is our 9/11 moment. And not to forget that after 9/11, there was a wave of Islamophobia and attacks on anyone who looked Muslim, which encompasses a wide swath of people. But certainly within our Asian American community, there have been mass shootings and killings of South Asian American people. And so, so we are in this moment and a beginning of a time of great pain and unemployment and suffering involving people losing the lives of family members and loved ones. And so for Asian Americans, we know that we are experiencing another pandemic, which is the pandemic of racism. It's not just in the United States, sadly, but it is a global pandemic of racism. And so the lessons of the past also show that the only way to deal with this is to come together. And I think, as the ABA president had just said, you know, it's important that the bar associations of color and everybody listening find ways to not take social distancing to mean isolation from each other, but to come together to say, this is not what America is about. This is not what humanity is about. So
thanks, Helen. On that note, many of us, when we were preparing for this conference, really wanted to talk about sort of the broader implications for democracy and not just the implications for the Asian American community itself. And so we're going to turn to Don Tamaki to kick off that conversation. Thanks, Helen. That was really great.
Thank you. I think we're going to see a video before I give my remarks, so why don't we show that?
This pandemic
started
came out
in
of
China.
China.
It did come from China.
We're seeing a disturbing rise in hate-filled attacks.
Every disease has ever came from China.
There has been an uptick in hate crimes against the Asian
A woman
community.
wearing a face mask was attacked in a New York subway station by a man claiming she was sick.
Why do you keep calling this the Chinese virus? There are reports of dozens of incidents of bias against Chinese Americans in this country. Why do you keep using this? A lot of people say it's racist.
The racism has also surfaced in classrooms.
This was the first time that I've ever felt I was being treated differently for being Asian.
The Chinese Exclusion Act.
Come from China.
If you're from China, I need to know. Move!
Internment camps ordered by President Roosevelt.
probation for killing a Chinese man.
People go out of their way to antagonize people that look different than them.
Great, Don.
Thank you, Karen. And I too want to especially thank the ABA and Karen Judy Perry Martinez for allowing us to put on this public awareness event in a way that's appropriate social distancing. And I'm going to try hard not to touch my face as I talk here. I'm going to start with a caveat, if I can. I'm going to be critical of Donald Trump, but not because of any partisan reason. I'm critical because of his behavior, and that's a behavior we've seen before by some Republicans and by some Democrats. For example, Franklin Roosevelt, who signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the incarceration of almost 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry, was a Democrat. Earl Warren, the great Chief Justice, who led the court to overturn segregation in Brown versus Board of Education, was a Republican. But during World War II, Earl Warren, the politician, ran for governor of the state of California on the slogan, "The Japs must go," whipping up fervor to put Japanese Americans into concentration camps. George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, who vowed segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, ran for the presidency 3 times as a Democrat. David Duke Gold, Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan in 1988, sought the Democratic Party nomination for president. In contrast, as Helen Zia points out in her excellent Washington Post op-ed piece, after the 9/11 attacks, it was President George Bush, a Republican, who warned the nation against Islamophobia and set the tone from the nation's highest office that targeting Muslims was not acceptable. So my focus is on the behavior of political leaders, not their party affiliation. Today, globally, we are seeing racist rhetoric from political leaders result in hate crimes, which in and of itself is obviously terrible. But there is an insidious process occurring that's even more dangerous than hate crimes and which threatens democracy itself. That is a rhetoric of bigotry. It's part of a playbook that tyrants have used since time immemorial to gain power by changing the nation's culture and ethos. How is this done? Well, in the United States, by purporting to define who is an American, who is not, who belongs here, and who doesn't. There are three elements to this playbook. Number one, appeal to prejudice. Number two, fearmonger and scapegoat. And number three, traffic in conspiracy theories, falsehoods, and alternative facts. We've seen this before. In 1942, General John L. DeWitt declared, quote, "The Japanese race is an enemy race." That was the conspiracy theory then. Like the Chinese virus moniker today, hate crimes followed, then against Japanese Americans. But the political goal of the rhetoric of racism was removal and incarceration, urged on by farming interests who view Japanese Americans as competition, and by budding politicians who built their careers by vilifying our community. Fred Korematsu defied the orders rounding up Japanese Americans. He was arrested and convicted. He appealed, and the government defended against his Supreme Court challenge by claiming that Japanese Americans were spying. To Fred's surprise, he lost. 37 years later, Department of Justice memos and official reports surfaced, revealing that the Navy and the FBI and the Federal Communications Commission categorically refuted each of the claims of the Army and concluded that Japanese Americans had done no wrong and that there was no reason to lock up this population, and that the Army's claims were, quote, intentional falsehoods. But so powerful was this culture of prejudice, the belief that Japanese Americans were an enemy race that didn't belong here, that despite protests from Department of Justice whistleblowers, that the government had a duty not to lie to the court. The government stood by the Army's claims, knowing that they were false, and suppressed evidence in order to manipulate the outcome of the Korematsu decision. For the court's part, it shamefully abdicated its traditional role as a check and balance on the abuse of power by the executive branch. It asked no questions, essentially reasoning, if the Army tells us that the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans makes the nation safer, then who are we to question the Army? Of course, the result was a civil liberties disaster. You know, as lawyers, we are trained to believe that facts and the law matter. But beware, if the culture shifts beneath our feet, where the country becomes so numb to Chinese virus, Mexicans are drug dealers and rapists, Islam hates us, the press is the enemy of the people, and dissenters are shouted down and whistleblowers are retaliated against. History teaches us that the country can descend into a very dark place where neither the facts nor the Constitution matters. That is the lesson of the Korematsu case. Racist rhetoric and hate crimes that follow are but one outcome of an even bigger issue, and that is losing our democracy. And in these days, as Helen points out, it's really critical that each of us does our part, both big and small, in order to draw public awareness to this occurrence and to stop it. Thank you.
Great, sorry. We will then add in the other two panelists for additional comments on the subject. Thank you, Dawn, that was very moving and powerful. Shall we go to Matt next?
Matt, you're on mute.
I think he's searching for his unmute.
Yes, I was I was searching for the button. You know, as we talk about democracy, and my goodness, what a great sort of overview that was from Don, and thank you to Helen for speaking on your excellent op-ed, and to both of you. I think one of the things that came up in my reporting was just this notion that during many of the things that you mentioned, Don, be it the Korematsu case decades ago, or certainly Japanese internment in the 40s, you know, there were no members of Congress who were Asian American. And so one of the differences, we talk so much about representation in these different spheres, that the lawmakers that I spoke with highlighted was that, in fact, you know, there is an entire Asian Pacific American caucus in Congress, and several members of it, and that those are the folks who have been able to come forward and both put out that letter that Ms. Chu put out in February, I think it was, and then it was Grace Ming, Representative Grace Ming of New York, who put out a resolution, I think it was in March, condemning anti-Asian American racism and hate. And so I think it was Mark Takano of California who was mentioning to me that he had, his father was interned and still had scars on his legs from the camps, and that, you know, there was no one to speak for them at that time. So while there are several things that folks have raised really justifiable concerns about, one of the silver linings I think that the politicians I've spoken to have raised is that there are at least voices out there putting these issues front and center in Washington.
Great. Helen, I'm sure you want to add to this conversation.
Well, just a couple of comments, and thank you, Matt, and thank you, Don. I was just so moved from the video and from Don's rundown of how comments, rants, really innuendo from the top halls of government have really had a tremendous impact. And, you know, there really aren't very good collections of hate crimes incidents across the country. And so as this pandemic began, some of the Asian American advocacy organizations, social justice organizations set up a couple reporting things. And immediately after the president's comments, they saw a huge spike in numbers of the very first week after the national emergency was declared and all of that China stuff was echoed. They had more than 600 reports of incidences. The second week, the same. So there were more than 1,000 incidents reported in the first week. And this was at a time when the police chief of San Francisco said he had received no reports whatsoever. So some people wonder whether these kind of pitting people against each other have real world effects. They do. And I just wanted to say, I think Don's emphasis and talking about democracy as a threat to our overall democracy is really what's at question here too. Because the politics of division, pitting one group against each other, is something that's gone on, and I think, as somebody who writes about history, has been a key theme as an attack on this democracy for the last 3 or 4 decades. And really, after the civil rights movement, that's been something that's been undertaken. And so let's not forget that hate groups really advance. And in their chat rooms, they talk about creating division, creating chaos, creating confusion, and that's how they most are able to disrupt democracy. And this is something that foreign agents also know and are taking advantage of. So we, if one of the outcomes of this virus is to weaken our society, our communities, that would be most devastating of all. And so what we can really do is to try to find ways to come out stronger, to take this time to really recognize what's most important to us, not only as individuals, but also in our society. And that's the ability to have a democracy and to work together and find civil ways to work through our differences, not by name calling, not by attacking other people, and certainly not by adding to violence in this society.
So we did see that in a lot of the reports of hate crimes, some of the perpetrators were in fact other people of color. And in the last election, when there was Russian interference in the election, there were a lot of trolls out there who were trying to promote division between whites and blacks and between minorities. Are you expecting to see more of that? Helen or Don or Matt?
I think we are already seeing that. We know that the most vulnerable communities, the essential workers, the people who have who don't even qualify for the unemployment or the CARES money, they are hurting the most. And so, you know, the pain and the misery that is being inflicted on people does come out in, you know, from every community in blaming. And so, unfortunately, these are the communities that most need us to come together and be supportive. So unfortunately, you know, no community is immune from racism. The Asian American community has its own biases too. And so this is where we really have to, within our communities, do our education, know that attacking each other is only hurting us all even more.
Yeah,
and Matt,
you know,
go ahead, Don, sorry.
Going to add, Karen, you know, history teaches us that just look at other societies, look at pre-war Germany, look what happened to Jews. And Jews weren't the only people attacked in pre-war Germany. All the other marginalized groups, including Catholics or including gays and lesbians, et cetera, were all attacked. They weren't the only ones that ended up being killed, murdered. So pitting one group against another follows a pretty ancient playbook. And I think our task is really twofold. One, to stop that immediately, to protect people. But secondly, look at the long range view of the impact on the society and where it is going. Because if that is left unchecked, that's how we lose the country. And people think you lose democracy, and they do come and go. If you look at the span of history, we tend to think that democratic systems last forever. They don't. They require eternal vigilance. And people think, well, you lose a democracy by sudden coup d'etat. You can also lose democracy incrementally by the crumbling of institutions, by the collapse of the culture, collapse of values of fairness, equality, facts, what is the truth, a common understanding of what truth is. So it really calls upon us, for all of us, to be aware of this.
Great. Matt, you talked about the fact that other politicians are stepping forward, and it's not just Asian American politicians and groups. So what have you seen?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think one of the things that folks that I spoke with also raised was this idea that it's been really nice to see the coalitions that have come together to back the Asian American community over the past several months from across the spectrum, right? And I've always, it would take a long time to sort of list the laundry list of groups that have joined onto letters and other things like that with members of the Asian American community, but that has happened. And to a point that Don and Helen have both brought up, I think, you know, there were a lot of echoes to folks, both about sort of the post 9/11 feelings toward anyone, as one expert put it, who looked brown at that time, who was being discriminated against. And of course, the Asian American community is so huge and not monolithic that we have our South Asian friends and everything like that who were in many cases pulled into that. And then even as recently as under the Trump administration, the Muslim ban, quote unquote, that was a moment where also the Asian American groups and other groups banded together with Muslim Americans and others to say, no, this is not appropriate. So to your point, Karen, I think it's a good one that we are seeing, I think, some encouraging signs leaders are saying about the ways in which when folks see this behavior, this racism, this xenophobia, the groups are getting together and mobilizing certainly more quickly and more collectively to make their voices heard in a really powerful way.
Yeah, I was extremely proud of the legal profession's response to the Muslim ban and the efforts by the administration to start turning people away and trying to deport people. The fact that attorneys were rushing to the airports to volunteer to help of all colors and all faiths, I think is one of the things perhaps, Don, you're talking about in terms of, how do we make sure that we're shoring up our democracy? And to me, that was, one of those moments in history where attorneys stepped up to do that. So, okay, so we are getting lots of requests about what do we do with all of this. And so I'm gonna kick it off. I'm gonna go back to Matt.
Sure.
Some suggestions.
Sure. I guess I'm not super in the business of suggesting. We try to sort of, present the information for.
You could talk about what media's role is.
Sure. And so that's exactly where I was going to go, Karen. I think, we try to present the facts and the information so that other folks that feel so inclined can act as they so choose. But I would say a couple things, and I have been observing the questions as they come in, so I'll try to address the ones on media. First, I will say that certainly there have been episodes that have been called to that I've seen because I'm a pretty big consumer of media, and also I think certainly some issues early on with New York Times coverage about the use of the phrase China virus when we didn't know anything about the virus, and that being used as a shorthand. I also think there certainly were, to one commenter's concerns, a period of time where photos were being used that were inappropriate, frankly, of Asian Americans in Flushing or something else to sort of depict this. I don't know. I think someone asked about sort of apologizing. We certainly make all efforts to put corrections and other pieces prominently where we've made a mistake. I will say, I think everyone in our building, and I think for journalists, for the most part, are doing their level best to make changes as soon as they realize that they've done something incorrect. Unfortunately, we are moving very fast in a lot of cases. That is not an excuse, and that's not to say that we haven't made mistakes. I'm not sure, whether we are in the business of putting out blanket apologies when we screw something up, but I have seen, certainly in my building, us fix things very quickly and be, really, see memos and other information go out to make sure that we don't make mistakes like that again. More broadly, I would say that one of the encouraging things I have seen is just that there are so many more Asian American reporters in the media space than I think we had even 5 or 10 years ago. I could rattle off a number of folks at the Times, at the Post, all over the place who are in the political space. I think typically a fairly, for years, a more white and male space. And as a result of that, we've seen more and more coverage in the mainstream and other media of these issues of racism and xenophobia as they have come up. I think, Karen, in your opening remarks, you noted comments that were made to a White House reporter who I know through AAJA, who was in the White House being able to ask President Trump some of these questions very directly because she has that access to him and brings this perspective to bear. And so one of the really encouraging things I've seen is just a much greater flood of coverage when these issues have come up because we have representation and diversity of the newsroom and folks are more attuned to these issues. So I am encouraged by that, though that is not to say that the media has made every step correct all the way along. I certainly would acknowledge that.
Yeah, Helen and I were talking about earlier during the prep call how it was reassuring to see that, in fact, a lot of the investment that we and others put into trying to diversify the newsrooms is having the impact that we thought it would. So that's very exciting to see. Let's go to Dawn next. Your thoughts, recommendations?
Well, I think this is a call to action for each of us to get involved at some level. You know, I had thought with, you know, with everyone sort of holed up in shelter in place, that it gives us a lot of time to think about these issues. And also, you know, people are reaching out to each other to make contact during this time of isolation. And so I sort of originally thought, well, maybe like a New Year's resolution, people would make a commitment, a pledge, a promise to get involved and be civically engaged. I think Helen correctly points out, we don't have to wait until we kind of come out of our holes to do this. And the point is basically, we need to do something. I think doing nothing is not an option. So what is that something? Well, I think the first thing is to reach out to our own networks. Many of us in the audience are involved in our organizations, local community groups who are involved directly in these issues. Other people are involved in parent-teacher organizations, in their temples, synagogues, and churches. Others have their own network of friends. And now is really the time to reach out and engage, to at least start the conversation about what is happening, and not only about the deplorable things of anti-Asian violence, but also where the country is going. For example, I'm very disturbed about the attacks on journalists, calling the press the enemy of the people, creating a situation where it endangers journalists' lives. This is what happens in third world countries. And we need to support the free press in this country. Education from K to 12 is critical important about anti-bullying and respecting diversity, understanding that prejudice should have no place. People can write checks to various groups who are working on anti-Asian violence, discrimination, democratic organizations. We're encouraging people, for example, to do their own screenings. There's a couple of great films out, about an hour in length, where people can stream and then through Zoom conferences have their own discussions. One is And Then They Came for Us, Abby Ginsburg. Another is Alternative Facts, John Osaki. We've been doing that in our Stop Repeating History campaign.org, in which we're encouraging people out there, those who are listening, to be leaders, to be heroes and heroines in your own community. We can lead on this issue. I think people whose immigrant past, as Helen points out, understands what it means to be targeted. We can speak with some moral authority to bring awareness to the public. So I think it's a time for, even if it's only to write a check, it's time for involvement.
Great, thanks, Don. Before we turn to Helen, I just want to remind people to, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A rather than the chat box, and we'll turn to Helen.
Yeah, I only have, I think what I'll do is just make it a little personal too, that people wonder, what do they do if they witness something or they experience something? Well, if you happen to see, hear, whether it's online or you're out walking the dog or taking the kids out and you see something or hear something, I participated in another webinar to listen in on a webinar sponsored by Asian Americans Advancing Justice and Hollaback, which has excellent suggestions on what to do if you're a bystander, that most people fear making things worse or getting hurt themselves. And within that range of doing nothing, there really are still things to do. And people who find themselves targeted, the one thing they wish is that somebody acknowledged that something bad happened to them. And even if that's somebody coughing, spitting, or saying some racist slur at them. And often that doesn't happen. So we all have ways we can get involved. If we're online right now, it means we have access to the internet and can report things. There are reporting sites. Stop AAPI Hate is one of them. You don't have to be the recipient of an attack. You can report what you've witnessed, and that's something that we can all do. But doing this is partly to be a participant in the democracy, to hold our officials, our law enforcement accountable, to be able to present information to the media so that they can report on these things. And so even from our homes or wherever we're sheltering, if we are privileged enough to be able to shelter, these are things that we can do, and to be in touch and send messages to our public officials, to congratulate our news media and support them when they are reporting on hate crimes or issues that really need to be illuminated on to bring people together. And one of the things that happened out of the Vincent Chin case was, even though that was a terrible time, people did come together to change laws, to advance hate crimes protections, to create things like having the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights that Karen Narasaki, you served as one of those commissioners, to have more reporting emphasis trainings among local officials, to have those things done. And really today, if we know these things are happening, we should be contacting our local city councils, our school boards, talking about what can be done about this, even though teaching may be online and some of those attacks may be online. So there are many things that can be done, many things that have been done by people coming together in horrible times that have affected all of us. Victim impact statements, for example, came out of the partly where the Vincent Chin case, where there were no statements presenting the harm that was done. And we see the Me Too movement has really done a lot of education by people being able to speak up. And so at this time, there's really a lot we can do. And so I just add to what Don and Matt have said.
Great, thanks. Helen, you mentioned, that we should be making sure that our elected officials are responding appropriately. We've actually gotten a couple of questions, one from an Austin City Council member, Nicole Golden, who says, what can public officials do to support the community? And what can community members do? And another from Andrea Vesa, who says, what can governors do at the state level to counter this rhetoric? A common united policy statement against hate crimes and hate speech, highlighting any anti-discrimination programs, targeted assistance. Have any governors done anything to your knowledge? Who would like to take any part of those questions up first?
Well, can I say one obvious thing about the COVID-19 responses? The leadership is really coming from local areas, the states and cities and municipalities. And if it wasn't for individual sort of regions moving quickly and independently, the loss of life would be more. I think that's just a medical scientific fact. And what that says to me is when you look at what we've been talking about, leadership at the local level, and I'm talking down to city councils and county supervisorial seats, borough leadership, and so on. That's really where culture can be addressed. And when the values and a culture shift in a real bad direction, I think that's the local areas are going to be the difference maker. So I put it back on the audience members themselves, some of you who are already in leadership positions, to continue to speak out. I mean, obviously it's made a difference in the COVID-19 response. It will make the difference going forward on issues like civil rights and keeping people safe. So I think that's the answer. Get involved locally in whatever capacity you can, if that makes sense.
Matt, go ahead, Helen, sorry.
I was just going to say that the questioners that you cited who said, what can people do? Can they, sorry, I had to eliminate something there on my screen. You know, whether governors can issue statements, whether local city council people can, you know, all of those things, yes, all of them above whatever the locality, you know, has capacity for and are empowered to do. Even acknowledging and coming out with a statement is really important for the Asian American constituents that people have. And I think from the November report that came out of the US Commission on Civil Rights, Karen, that you were part of, it said one of the problems in even states that do have hate crimes protections is how they're implemented on the local level. So a lot of education needs to happen, and this is an opportunity to point out to government employees, you know, throughout on the ground to say, this is going on too. Please be aware that this might happen. Don't discount it if somebody comes and reports something that happened to them. You know, we know that a lot of localities and states do not have hate crimes protections, partly because the model hate crimes protections include being protected if you're attacked, if you're gay or lesbian or because of sexual orientation. And many states have blocked having hate crimes protections because of that. Well, these are things that all are part of what we're talking about today. You know, things that keep us divided. So to the extent that we can advance those in states and local communities that have not been able to come together around saying that nobody should be attacked because of who they are, this is a time that we can really move those forward.
Yes, thanks, Helen. Actually, one of my last trips as a commissioner was to a state briefing in Wyoming. Wyoming is one of the few states that doesn't have any kind of hate crime for anyone. And they said, they were saying, well, it's because we don't have hate crimes, but the Native Americans who testified begged to differ with that. And as our report pointed out, when hate crimes rise against one group, actually it tends to rise against all groups. So even though Asians may be the target, the impact is usually felt more widely. So Matt, one of the questions was, has any governors done anything to your knowledge? I know that the New York governor spoke out very strongly because he was aghast at some of the reports of attacks happening in New York City. And one of the things I wanted to point out is some of these attacks are happening in very multicultural places. I mean, even San Francisco near Chinatown and Miami. So what are you seeing in terms of which politicians are stepping up and what they're doing?
Yeah, you know, I actually have had to pivot from some of my politics stuff to help our Metro department cover the coronavirus, because here in New York, of course, is sort of the epicenter of the outbreak. And to your point, certainly Mr. Cuomo has been outspoken about this issue at his daily briefings, and so too has Governor Phil Murphy over in New Jersey. He has spoken out. Many of these governors who have had a platform every day have just had a lot of airtime, and so as these issues have come up, they have spoken about it. I would just add one related point, and from a previous conference call I did on this issue too, and again, I don't necessarily want to get into the advocacy space, but folks have raised this issue of what happens if you make a report, how does that get enforced? And what is the downstream impact of that? Are there folks who are going to be able to go and investigate, or what happens there? And so I think that's something I was on a call with folks from the Justice Department who thinking about, you know, what we actually do here. But yeah, I mean, I certainly think there has been sort of this broader awareness of the xenophobia and discrimination, particularly since the president started using the China virus rhetoric. And certainly local officials, especially those in places with really diverse populations, such as New York and New Jersey, and I can't be sure, but I would imagine California with Governor Newsom, And the mayors of those cities have certainly been forthcoming with their condemnation of this behavior.
Great. Farzana asks, what advice do you have to be more intentional about countering white supremacy values that are so damaging to our democracy? I will note there was a Washington Post article a couple of days ago on anti-Asian violence, and there are researchers who are monitoring the dark web and the alt-right channels. Twitter had to take down a tweet that actually called on people to kill all Chinese. So this is a very serious issue. Any advice?
Well, go ahead, Ellen, I'm sorry.
No, well, I was just going to say, I think all of the suggestions that have come up in this discussion already about coming together and defending our democracy, as well as people who are under attack for who they are, no matter what groups they are. Those are all ways to counter white supremacy, strategies, because the main strategy is to disrupt, to pit people against each other, to attack groups that they feel are less than human. When I was a reporter, I did a lot of investigation on neo-Nazi and hate groups, white supremacy groups, and this is their main playbook. Anybody can find out. They put it out there. They are happy when there is chaos and disunity, and this is one of their main activities, to destroy democracy so that they can advance. And so by doing the opposite of supporting people and saying, you know what, we are better as a society and as a human civilization when we are able to work together and support each other and recognize the humanity of every human being, that this is the best way, I think, to counter these hate groups.
Great. Well, one of the things I've learned, because I work on the census and we've had to try to combat any misinformation or disinformation on the web, is it actually makes it worse if you repeat what the bad guys are saying, and it's better to try to put out as many positive things to counter that and make sure that that information is coming up first. And so people might want to look at, who are working on the issue of hate crimes, look at their search engine and optimize them so their information is coming up before the bad stuff is coming up. So another attendee asks, I'm getting questions from my non-lawyer friends about offensive remarks and treatment from their bosses and coworkers. What advice can you share? So Don, I think your firm kind of takes care of some of these kinds of issues.
Well, some of it legally can be actionable, especially if it's a threat of violence. In California, there's a hate crime statute. It's called making terrorist threats. And, I've dealt with hate crime litigation in which I defended a Palestinian American family who was being attacked by a neighbor who threatened repeatedly to kill them. And so there is actions that lawyers can do. But on the other stuff that is not legally actionable, but very offensive, and again, if you let it go unchecked, it changes the culture, does change the culture. And I think to have enough courage, and it does take courage to say something, to put a stop by that, by saying, that's not acceptable, that's offensive. Even if it's just a comment, is important to start the conversation. Now, if it goes into an area where people feel retaliated against by a superior to a subordinate in an employment setting, then again, that's the time that lawyers might be able to get involved. But on a day-to-day level, I mean, each of us has to be vigilant to say it in strong or gentle ways to educate, the public about the consequences of letting this kind of thing go unchecked. I would add, just as sort of an addition to Ellen's point, about white supremacy, and your point, Karen, that we have to be looking toward democratic institutions. Certainly one is census and how important it is, and state and local elections with respect to things like gerrymandering. And the consequence of gerrymandering it can be voter suppression, and the discounting and the diminution of people's voices. And again, that's something that all of us can be a part of in our own democratic institutions to promote policies to stop that.
Great. So one of our questioners is asking, are we seeing any discrimination in housing? And if so, what should be done about that? Matt, have you seen any reports of that kind of discrimination resulting?
Well, I think one of the things that we've seen really clearly really came on the radar, I think, last week or so, is the terrible way in which this virus has targeted communities of color and some of our most disadvantaged communities, sort of overall in terms of who is becoming sick and who is dying. And I frankly shudder to imagine the sort of already yawning inequality we have here in this city and where I'm from in California, and sort of what this is going to look like if we ever get to the other side of this. Karen, do you think we're asking specifically about whether there has been housing discrimination against Asian Americans?
Yeah, because of COVID.
I have not heard as much about that as I have heard just the particular concern of sort of folks really feeling scared to go to the grocery store and walk around on the street, and certainly folks who have been wearing masks forever, now suddenly feeling doubly self-conscious about being an Asian American person wearing a mask in public, and sort of what that might gin up in certain folks' heads. I have not yet heard about housing discrimination, though. I would say, many of the folks in the advocacy community are very concerned that, this problem is going to get better and not worse. And I think I mentioned early on the Trump campaign ad that seemed to strike an anti-Chinese tone here. I don't see this sort of rhetoric going anywhere over the next several months. And so it would be hard to rule anything out.
So Michelle Lowe asks, for those of us who are homeschooling our kids, any educational resources we can access for this issue? Don, I'm sure you have some responses.
Korematsu Institute, Karen Korematsu has created really fine curriculum development kits, and they give them away free. And so parents can access that. And I would just check Korematsu Institute on the internet, and it tells you how you can download and to get these materials. Also, there's lots of movies and video bits out there that are very helpful in teaching children values, teaching students, young people, high school students, junior high values and on this issue. So, and also you can contact me and us for any more specific information. Happy to connect.
Great. This is a question I think meant for you, Helen. Ellie Lee asks, is there an educational resources that contextualize the anti-Asian hate crimes in terms of the plight of other people of color? Do you have any opinions about alternatives to calling the police, particularly if the perpetrator might be Black or Latinx?
About that, because yes, the question of calling the police is one that affects all communities, including the Asian American community itself. It's largely immigrant, and all of the attacks on immigrants today have and the attempt to make that an extension of and the threatened deportations. All of these things are issues for our communities. And so the way I look at it is that we have to hold our institutions accountable. And it's really up to, the people involved about whether to call the police or law enforcement or not, given, the issues that Black Lives Matter, has brought to the front. And so that's one thing. They exist, they have to be held accountable. They have also part of recognizing this is a multiracial society. I think there are a lot of books available, a lot of essays. Resources do examine the relationships of, and I think this is to point out that that going forward, where we are today and going forward, our society as an American democracy is growing more diverse every day. And really within the next 10 years or about, there's going to be no majority race in the whole country. And what that means is that we're going to be a society of communities that really do need to work together, and we will be stronger if we do. And so there are books and scholars and community advocates, public thinkers who really talk about this and how we can work together as different communities and break down the systematic barriers that are really been put into place for us to be wedge, Asian Americans in particular, to be a wedge group to divide and be countered to other communities. So for Asian Americans, one of those would be to do a search on the model minority, the quote model minority, the thing that says we are a better minority, because, even just the name, if you are the good minority, well, then who's the bad minority? And that history of that term itself was created not by Asian Americans. We never defined ourselves that way, but was there's a history of that. There's a time and place of that. It arose out of the civil rights movement to use Asian Americans as a critique against African Americans who are fighting for their civil rights. And, the irony is that Asian Americans were also there fighting for civil rights too. But so all of these, this kind of information is available. And I would just suggest searching on some of those things, but searching on the model minority myth, the model minority lie will generate a lot of thinking and how we can disrupt this thing of pitting one minority, quote, minority group against another.
We have some participants who in the Q&A are noting that this is not just a US problem, but a global problem, and a particular problem in Canada, where an ER nurse who was Asian American was spat upon, and that the Chinese Canadian National Council is also documenting. So we do have participants from around the world, and I think Helen had noted earlier that this is a global problem that requires sort of real leadership around the world on this. So we have a question about, would you suggest that lawyers offer pro bono assistance to victims? So Don, I'm going to toss that to you because you're
well, of course,
you're the only working attorney on this panel.
It depends on where you are in the country, but I have to say, in the Bay Area and in Southern California, and in New York and some of the other places, lawyers in some of these law firms are very eager to get involved in defending these rights. In other areas, it might be more difficult. In other areas, it might be an issue of educating folks. But we found that they're there. I mean, there are lawyers in all parts of the country that once the story gets out there that are interested in fighting these issues. And there are a number of organizations out there within the bar associations things that the American Bar Association promotes, but as well as the local state bars and the affinity bars. So that would be a source of involvement. There is an educational process involved. Having done some of these hate crimes cases in the past, even in the quote more liberal areas like the San Francisco Bay Area, they really did not, to Helen's point, take it very seriously. I mean, I know this for a fact, because I in one case, horrendous case, I did 3 contempt trials on the same guy, all found held in contempt, refused to give him jail time, and ultimately it ended up in him grabbing a gun and opening fire on my client. And only then did the authorities take that seriously. Thankfully, that's not the case not the case now, and it's because of the educational process involved. And I think we can liken it to not only the educational process that went on in the civil rights movement, but certainly with the LGBTQ and the velocity of change of gay marriage and so on that's happened. And Helen mentioned the Me Too movement also. There was a culture shift that I think was very important in educating people. And you may be, depending on where you live, among the first people to sort of raise this issue and move the ball forward as far as public awareness. And lawyers can be a very integral and very important part in moving that process. So it involves both representation in the legal sense, but more importantly, it's just educating the public and your networks about how important these issues are.
So we have a couple of questions about how Asian Americans and Asians around the world, how can they protect themselves? What should they do if they're facing verbal and physical attack?
Well, if no one else has a comment on this, if you're a victim, of course, the main thing is your own safety and to be safe. For bystanders, it depends on the situation, but I think to ignore it, to Helen's point, people need acknowledgement. It has to be called out. It has to be put a label on it, and you can't fight this on your own. You have to report it. And if it goes unspoken and it's secret, nobody knows about it, again, it's as if it never occurred. So getting the information out there is really among the most important things. As far as the level of violence is concerned, it depends. And at some point, it may be an issue of self-defense. It may be an issue of calling the police, maybe an issue of other people coming to your aid. And I've seen this again in doing my own, some of my own cases. What do you do? And for my client, at some point, best alternative was to run. After I failed, after 3 contempt findings, with the court refusing to give the perpetrator any jail time, I went to them and I said, I cannot protect you. If I were you, I would move. And literally the next day after they signed the papers to sell their house, this guy confronted them on the property line with an automatic pistol. So it's really for democratic institutions like the courts to be more aware from the get-go to stop this. And how does that happen? Public awareness. People have to report these things. So I think that's where it begins.
And to that point, I would just say that I think Vincent has put in some really helpful links in the chat here of the various organizations. I'm aware of at least 3, but there are probably more at this point that have created both toolkits that try to address exactly what folks are asking for, which is how do you deal with this, and also reporting mechanisms to at least provide some sort of documentation of things that either you are a bystander for or that you very unfortunately were the victim of.
Yeah, and I would say the Civil Rights Commission in the report, what we wanted to do was not just highlight the issue, but also try to provide best practices. So we actually looked at several law enforcement agencies that we thought were doing a fairly good job. One of the challenges, as we all know, for in particular the Asian and immigrant communities, is limiting English proficiency. And so one of the things I would suggest for bar association groups or elected officials is to be talking to their sheriffs and police departments and be asking them to make sure that they have information on their website about how to report, that they have it in multiple languages, that their police go out and meet with, well, you can't really meet, I guess, meet virtually as much as you can with communities to let them know how to report and to let them know, as Don says, that it's going to be taken seriously. And that kind of holding law enforcement accountable and assisting them and letting them know if your organization is available to help walk a victim through the process, I think is going to be very important. So we are unfortunately 5 minutes to close, and I have some closing remarks, so we're only going to be able to take a couple more remarks. So Helen, I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah, on to the point about this being global. I just wanted to add that we know it's global. I fell upon a Wikipedia. Somebody posted something about global pandemic incidents against Asian Americans by country, and it's shocking. And so to the extent of getting our national networks involved, groups that are, say, part of the union movements around the world and have international connections, are national government officials and organizations, this may be a time to actually get some sort of international networking done on this, and whether the World Health Organization has to get involved or some other UN kind of body to at least address this as a global, endangerment as well. Maybe that is something to get going.
So I invite the panelists to look at the various questions, and if you find one that you could type an answer to, do that while I finish the closing remarks. I first, of course, want to thank all of our panelists who I think shared very extraordinary expertise with us today, and the ABA section on civil rights and social justice for hosting it. I'd like to note we did get many questions. This has been videotaped and it will be made available, I believe, later today or tomorrow on the ABA website. Want to also thank the many co-sponsors who are thankfully very numerous, unfortunately too many to list individually, and to Vincent Eng and Ali Kielsgaard for all of their help in pulling this program together. We hope that all of you in the audience found the briefing provocative and helpful. And for those of you in the legal profession, please consider joining the section or making a donation at americanbar.org/donate-CRSJ so it can continue to bring you free rapid response programs. For more than half a century, the section and its members have worked on hundreds of issues addressing a very broad range of civil rights, civil liberties, and international human rights. And I think all the panelists would agree that that is a very important role for the section to be playing. For that, I will turn it over to Ali in case you have any closing remarks.
Nope. Thank you all so much, and I hope everyone else has a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very